For this event particularly, I ask that you regard phones of all types and shapes as grotesquely annoying. As the metaphorical one in the book suggests, the apparently real and really annoying looking one on the table and the technologically advanced one in your pocket. Make phone adjustments now so that we are only bothered by Will Self's comments about his. In keeping with the one-word title of this one-chapter, 617-page text, please evidence a singular propriety when speaking to our guest. Expect one very fine evening, demand not one thing, and above all, buy at least one of Will's books. I'm David B. Johnson. I'm full-time self-cell coordinator at P&P, and I'm a part-time professor of philosophy, actually, at Marymount University across the river in Arlington, Virginia. Like any informed phenomenologist, I notice small things outside my mind and my body, and then I go out of my way to see how they might fit my own lived experience, or to see about the boundaries between inner and outer spaces, between subjectivity and objectivity, clarity, and in the case of this book, madness, prejudice, and reality. The little epigraph at the beginning of Phone, for instance. It's from Artie Lange's two-section work, The Politics of Experience, which, like his other works, challenges the idea, borrowing from the phenomenologists, of normality in our society, and argues that it is not merely people who are mad, but the world and its various cultures as well. Phone is the final installment in what is perhaps the most ambitious and important literary project in the 21st century. I mean that, by the way. I tend not to do fiction very much in my world. But Will Self's work, especially this book, has to be read. Referencing both Umbrella and Shark, and I mean referencing, it looks back to it as if it's referencing in the same way that maybe some sort of nonfiction work would do. This singularly substantial book traces Zach Busner, now 78, and the breakdown, or perhaps the buildup of his mind. Will Self should be regarded, and has been, as one of the best writers in the English language who is currently alive. We ask that you please welcome Will Self.
Thank you very much, David. That was great. That was a great introduction. It was really. There's a jazz club in Ronnie Scott's called Ronnie Scott's in London, quite a famous jazz club. And when there's a small audience in for the evening, Ronnie Scott, who's long deceased now, would stand up and say, "Let's join hands and contact the living." But I got to say, I'm grateful to you all for making it out on a very rainy night here in DC. So it's thank you. It's good to see you here. And what can I say? I mean, David said something about this. I suppose the sales pitch would be the books stand alone. You don't necessarily have to wrestle with the entire 1,500-page trilogy. And I think one reviewer in England called this last volume of the trilogy, a 620-page epic anti-tweet, which I think in some ways might cover it. I mean, I have to say, I in a sense, I could have picked a better time to be producing literary works that require fairly lengthy attention spans. And I suppose the kind of cosmic irony is that, particularly with this book, that what it's trying to do, and the modernist techniques I use, the stream of consciousness, the continuous present, the way in which the narrative, although focalized through individuals, moves between individual consciousnesses as if they were in some way connected, is my intention is to try and convey in prose the new world of bidirectional digital media that we've entered into, and the continuous line of the text that does indeed run for 620 pages without a paragraph break or any other sort of break, it kind of reflects the news threads and the stock market quotations that are continuously running, really like some sort of strange, constant set of subtitles beneath our own consciousness, as if it were no longer possible, back to phenomenology, as if it were no longer possible, the Merleau-Ponty and the classic phenomenologists would have the épochet, the bracket, they just say, take your consciousness like this and interrogate it with no preconceptions. But what I find nowadays when I interrogate my consciousness with no preconceptions is that there's a kind of ticker tape of text running beneath it already. So with the trilogy overall, each of the volumes attempts to relate a evolution in human technology, a war, and a form of mental pathology as well. So the first volume, Umbrella, dealt with the First World War and dealt with this bizarre illness, encephalitis lethargica, that was a kind of prequel, if you will, to the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918-19, and left about 2 million people worldwide in these bizarre comas from which some of them didn't awake for decades. A famous book was written about it by the neurologist Oliver Sacks called Awakenings, which was also filmed with De Niro playing the Sacks role. And Sacks was working at Highlands Hospital in Brooklyn in the late 60s when he was involved in this, and I kind of transferred that story to London. In the second volume, I looked at the Second World War, Shark. I looked at Hiroshima, and what I believe to be, my view is, and it really follows on from what David was saying, was that everything in the world changed on August the 6th, 1945. I think that if we can say that the world is crazy, I think its worst craziness begins then. And really it's looking to R.D. Laing and behind him to the anthropologist Gregory Bates, and that I got these ideas that went into Shark. Laing took this idea from Bateson of the double bind, the idea that if you, for example, if a parent says to a child, I love you, that the child receives two messages, receives the adult's anger and rejection as well as the manifest statement that the adult loves them, and that this introduces a kind of, the double bind into the child. The child doesn't know where to go and is forced into a kind of split-mindedness, a kind of mental diplopia, or even a kind of schizophrenic state. And I think that's what the atomic bomb did to humanity. I think that the atomic bomb made of everybody's government a parent that was saying to them, I love you, because the very people that we look to for some kind of leadership, for some kind of moral guidance, are also the people who have their finger very close to the button that can not only destroy us, but can destroy all humanity. So I do see that as a kind of colossal double bind that the whole of us, all of us who were either alive in 1945 or have been born subsequently, have been subjected to. And I'm not saying that there's a strictly causal relationship between innovations in technology, innovations in warfare, and these kind of mental problems, these kind of psychological problems. I don't think it's causal in that way, and nor do I see technology as something that we plan and initiate. I think technology is kind of immanent to human being in that way, and that's why we find it so difficult to understand why it's the machines that we create so conspicuously fail to serve us so much of the time. And it was kind of inevitable with the trilogy that I would end up with the post-9/11 wars in the Middle East, and it felt kind of inevitable that I'd end up with what I choose to call bidirectional digital media, because I think that captures the particular character of this suite of new technologies. I mean, it's worth reflecting that thinkers like Marshall McLuhan, Jean Baudrillard, Guy Debord all saw something like the web already in existence in the 20th century. You know, McLuhan called it the unified electrical field, and he dated it from the late 1920s. And in a way, I think we've been kind of sucker punched by the new technologies. We're surprised at the way that they're affecting us at an ontological level, because we thought we understood how a suite of technologies like this would operate. After all, we've had instantaneous stock market quotations flying around the world. We've had a globalized world before the First World War. So we kind of thought we had a handle on that. But I think that this particular new technological age is different in kind. And I think that the kind of pathologies that we associate with the inception of bidirectional digital media are, on the one hand, Alzheimer's. We have an aging population in the West. And just as with the synthesis by Albert Hofmann of lysergic acid dialthomide 25, better known to us as LSD, in 1942 in the war, 3 years before the dropping of the atomic bomb. And certain of us who belong to the baby boomer generation will be well familiar with the old canard that acid came along to make us, vitiate the effects of the bomb in some way. It's hard not to see a strange serendipitousness between our invention of this fantastically powerful handheld computer that we now all have in our pocket, and the fact that most of us are getting quite a lot older and are finding it quite difficult to remember anything. And there does seem to be something kind of odd going on there. Just as the kind of canard that this and the associated technologies are the creation of kind of uber autistics in Silicon Valley who've developed these technologies, one, because they're super good at coding, and secondly, because they find eye-to-eye contact or non-verbal cues in social contexts very difficult to cope with, so they invented FaceTime, so that they didn't actually have to be in a context in which they depended on non-verbal social cues. And yeah, we could dismiss that. We could say that's a canard, that's ridiculous, and it doesn't really mean anything. But we're not convinced, really. We do feel that there's something a little strange, again, about this odd serendipitousness. So, that's what I wanted to capture. And in a way, we're in a bookstore called Politics and Prose, and that there is a 100-page section of the novel that is set in Iraq and set among the British troops who were involved in the Iraq intervention. And there's a whole swathe to the novel that is concerned with the rights and wrongs of the British decision to join the coalition of the willing, which, as you'll recall, was based on an intelligence dossier that was actually presented here by Colin Powell when he was Foreign Secretary of State, but in England was used by Tony Blair to establish the legality of the British intervention in Iraq, but of course was subsequently shown to have been sexed up, was the phrase. I mean, I don't really? Sexed up? That's not my idea of anything erotic. I mean, the sexing up was the idea that Saddam Hussein had a capability in terms of chemical weapons or nuclear weapons to attack within 45 minutes and had a strike capability. Sounds familiar in the light of the crises we've had with North Korea over the past 6 months or so. Of course, they never found any chemical weapons or biological weapons in the wreckage of Iraq. And we pretty much know who doctored the dossier, and you can say what you will about the British state, but it does, and you can say what you will about the American state, but perhaps the quality of our democracy is established more by our inquiries into our government's malfeasances and bad behavior than it is by anything our governments actually do. And in 2016, something called the Chilcot Report was published in Britain, and that had been 7 or 8 years in the making. And this was the official government-sponsored inquiry into the lead-in to the Iraq War. And all the parties you would expect to be indicted were indeed indicted. The politicians who were involved in assembling the notorious dodgy dossier, the intelligence people who supplied the material and allowed it to be doctored prejudicially in favor of the cause for war, and the army, who, you know, and again, I think this needs to be perhaps stated. Maybe this is not exactly the right place to do it, but you're listening. You know, you're here, and perhaps you don't know that this report came out and indicted the British Army for not telling the politicians that they were not capable with the resources they had of doing the job. And again, it's something that the British haven't spoken about much, and I've never seen it said. The British were defeated in Iraq. The two provinces that the British army held in Iraq, they had to retreat from. They retreated from Basra under the cover of the Mahdi army, under the cover of the Shia militia who were in fact running those provinces. It was a defeat. The British were defeated. They never speak about that. The army-nation complex continues to brute itself about and continues to operate in lockstep with the American military as well. Indeed, the army officers I spoke to in the course of researching for this book told me that within the upper echelons of the British Army, they no longer regard themselves as a separate army. They regard themselves as being a bit like the USM, being a large formation within the American military. So that's kind of interesting that the military think in that way. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of the terrain of the book, and then it might surprise you that the passage I'm going to read doesn't seem to, well, it deals, of course, with the protagonist of the book, this veteran psychiatrist, Zach Busner, who's been with me since 1991. He's appeared in various of my narratives and books, and he is indeed himself now beginning to suffer the effects of Alzheimer's, and indeed, fortunately, he has got, or unfortunately does have, a smartphone in his pocket. And in this passage, we meet him in the breakfast area of a Hilton hotel in Manchester, in the north of England. Phone. A world is shimmering into being, Busner thinks. Bodying forth from the handset, the manager of the Podium restaurant holds clamped against his head. Visible waves of materiality ripple into the human spectral range, bearing this flotsam on their crests. A newsreader slapped across a wall-mounted flat-screen TV, a news thread ever unzipping his comfortable belly. A whole melon poised on a mound of crushed ice, its flesh elaborately tooled into tight, leafy tessellations, so it resembles a monstrous artichoke. Beyond this are more shape-shifting legumes, a forest of miniature carrot trees surrounded by swirls of cucumber and tomato roundels, a steel tripod bearing a jungly mess of salad leaves and multicolored peppers. Further away, through the misty atmosphere, Busner spots an entire continental section, frills of ham and cooked meats, cheese slices fanned out around an entire gouda on a wooden trencher. And there are people, guests, shuffling alongside the counter, tonging black bread, dill pickles, mini muff things and full-sized croissants onto their already high-piled plates, or spooning porridge into deep white bowls, or thrusting specialist scoops into Tupperware tubs, full of organic muesli, honey nut cornflakes, and Rice Krispies, blebs. All Busner can see as his own head waggles furtively, first to the right, then to the left, are other heads hanging in the air, eerily illuminated by the spotlights above the counter, disembodied by the steam rising from it. They are, he thinks, each and every one a world entire. Around all this orbits all the coconuts and the curries and the Castlefield Canal. All conditioned phenomena are a dream, an illusion, a bubble, a shadow, like dew or a flash of lightning. Thus shall we perceive them. He holds this thought, while thinking that it too is a conditioned phenomena, then all at once is puffed up with giddy spiritual pride. Perhaps this is it, he exults. I've slipped into enlightenment, as a lesser man might, a ditch. But then he considers, that's exactly the sort of pride which can lead novices into the most awful, glistening, glutinous, sickly-smelling swamp. Busner's gaze wanders from a serving dish heaped with baked beans into a charnel house. Glinting, calcified slices of black pudding, oozing grease, still greasier sausages, and a great Rattenkönig of bacon, smeared with globs of white fat, its rinds woven into a gristly plate. This is where desire, that most conditioned phenomena of all, ends, he acknowledges wearily, in the abattoir, where the poor beast is first poleaxed, then flayed. The manager, it says as much on the badge he wears on his lapel, has freed his ear from the wall-mounted phone behind the breakfast buffet and shimmered into a dark green suit with lighter green silken lapel facings, pocket flaps, and reveres. I've Maurice to thank for that. Never spare money on tailoring, Zachary. See the flaps on these pockets? Lovely bit of stitching. The clothes maketh the man. The clothes maketh the man. Down to Dave Wax the Schneider on Hammersmith Broadway. Soft touch on the inside leg. Nice bit of schmutter that. Never afraid of a cliché, Jews or Englishmen. As for English Jews, it's a fair cop, governor, you got me banged to rights for saying nice bit of schmutter that. What was the final result of all those fittings? In Maurice's case, a wholly irrational belief that he passed, that he could have himself sewn into the very model of a modern major general. Not that he was fool enough to try passing for a military man, but he wore tailored English suits and shirts, handmade English shoes, St. Michael's not-so-hairy vests, pants and socks, gold cufflinks from Asprey's, gold fountain pens from Parker, leather wallets, pocketbooks and card cases from Smythson's. That he sported Italian and French silk ties only confirmed him in his opinion of his own essential Englishness. If the angels of death were to come swooping down over London on swept-up Stuka wings, if they were to dive, deploying some sort of Semitic blood-seeking equipment, then they wouldn't locate Maurice, who'd remain in the drawing room at Reddington Road, sipping tea, listening to the light program. You can do it with a Latin from Manila to Manhattan. The ready-to-wear others would be selected, transported, forced to remove their own inferior clothing, gassed, then flayed. The clothes maketh the man, and the meat puppet. Would you come with me, The manager's opening salvo is sung over by the smartphone in Busner's pocket, which bursts into life, throbbing in a hand that had forgotten it was holding it.
This old man, he played knick-knack on my thumb.
Ringing tones that lance between Busner and the manager, then pierce the wavering heads further along the buffet, looping them into,
with a knick-knack, paddywhack, give a dog a bone.
the manager, Busner's amused to see, cannot proceed. He is held in check by the ringing, singing thing I hold. This old man came rolling home. Busner withdraws the smartphone from his pocket, and together this old man and the manager stare at its screen, while the rondo continues.
This old man, he played knick-knack on my shoe.
No caller ID. The semantics of this simple statement bother Busner. How should this be interpreted? Is it that the caller is devoid of an identity due to some psychological or physical trauma? Or is it the smartphone which is unable to establish the identity of the person making the call? The latter would seem more logical and to be consistent with Busner's, albeit hazy, telecommunications knowledge, although to support the former comes this paddywhack notion. Surely only a sentient machine could establish that the entity contacting it is devoid of self-consciousness. That the smartphone's self-aware seems indisputable, since it continues to cry out,
Give a dog a bone,
and launches into the next verse,
This old man, he played three,
with positively gay abandon, while the manager and the disembodied heads are unable either to look away or to intervene. Busner can remember well enough when his grandson downloaded the ringtone.
Choose something catchy that you'll definitely remember, Gramps,
he'd said,
because you can have just about anything you want as a ringtone, and when you're in public, it's confusing if you hear a phone ringing and don't know if it's yours.
Yes, it was confusing. Ever since his grandson had alerted him to the phenomenon, Busner has heard them. The old Bakelite phones, resonating in new suit pockets and shiny patent leather handbags. The young people doing some sort of schuhplattler, slapping their thighs and hips as they hopped from one foot to the other. You don't got to have an abstract sort of noise thingy, Gramps. You can download a tune, or even someone singing an old pop song. He'd scrolled down the options, clicking on one after another, but Gramps hadn't wanted to twist and shout, do the locomotion, or rise up on a dizzying theremin fugue. He tapped the screen. That one! Play me that one! Although he'd no idea why.
Knick-knack, paddywhack, give a dog a bone.
The synthesized tootling summoned up the old nursery rhymes words so effectively he'd heard the voices of scores of marching Chinese orphans. But why? And why were they singing an English nursery rhyme? It hardly mattered. The important thing was, being the possessor of a smartphone with a distinctive ringtone made him able to hold the manager at bay, because with thumbs and knees and shoes and doors, the ringtone assembles a little booth around Busner, a sequestration within which I can press button A, while the manager remains impotently outside, unable to enter this very public private space. Instead, they stand and stare, and Busner wonders if the manager is also preoccupied by the possible meanings of no caller ID, until, on my hip, it stops. The manager gently grasps Busner's elbow and, speaking very slowly and distinctly, says, "Come along now. I hope you aren't gonna make any trouble." Slipping the smartphone into his jacket pocket, Busner replies, "Trouble? Why would I make any trouble? Besides, why do you want me to go anywhere?"
Come along now, sir, the manager says, tightening his grip. This is hardly the appropriate place to stand about in. Oh, bloody hell, man, you're naked. Thank you. I think, given numbers, you can all have 4 questions each. I'm going to generously hand them out. If they're jostling in your mind, these questions, it would seem churlish to refuse them. But if anybody does have a question, I'm happy to oblige.
So there seem to be some snippets of Joy Division lyrics in this book.
Yeah. Don't tell Ian Curtis's widow, because she's notoriously litigious. Yeah. It's kind of interesting that, well, that wasn't your question, but if you want a supplementary, I'll...
Oh, well, I have more than one.
All right, get that.
So, did the band, did you listen to the band while writing, or is that swirling around in your head all the time?
That track of Decades, the last Joy Division album, made a huge impression on me when I was a young man. I guess that album must have come out when I was 20. And the news of Curtis's suicide. I mean, you remember, you don't look quite old enough to have been around then. Or you're probably around, but I don't imagine you were listening to Joy Division. You were in 84, but you remember how kind of news would percolate through subcultures then. Even something like, the band were quite an underground band. They'd recorded a bit, they released albums, but you just... he became this iconic and rather numinous figure because of his very early suicide. And, of course, there's been the Anton Corbijn film about him since then and that sort of thing. But the lyrics seemed particularly suitable. All of the novels have a lot of popular song in them. It's not just Joy Division. There's snippets of lyrics from everybody all over them. And not just contemporary popular song, but the popular song of whatever era, because the trilogy spans overall about 130 years or more. So there's a lot of music in there. With the first book, I zealously contacted all of the rights holders and paid for the rights. One of the reasons you don't see popular song quoted much in contemporary fiction is because it's very expensive. And I paid for the quotes in the first book myself, and it cost me £9,000 for what I wanted to quote. Because it's quite a tricky business, rights permission. With pop songs, if you think about She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah by the Beatles, you might get away with quoting With a Love Like That, okay? But you probably wouldn't get away with Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah. That would be reckoned to be suggestive of the entire song, and you'd have to pay. Yeah? It was quite expensive. When it got to the second book, Shark, I said to the editor, if you seriously imagine the rights holders on these pop songs, and I never use more, justifiable use is in fact. The problem is in theory, you can use a couplet for nothing. But with popular song, if the rights holder says that's effectively a synecdoche of the whole song, you have to pay for the permission. So I said to the editor, if you seriously think the rights holders are going to go through this 500-page neo-modernist novel, which they would have to read with some attention to detail in order to discover where I've banjaxed the occasional couplet of popular song, you've got another thing coming. But you, sir, keep it zipped.
I had a question about a possible allusion. William Gaddis's novel J.R. And somewhere in the middle of the novel, it's a stream where you change streams between different characters, and you always do it in a very strange fashion, like someone's walking down the street talking to someone, and then you pick up the conversation of people walking in the opposite direction. Kismet, they're all characters in the novel. But one of them is a phone where the I probably have this wrong, but but the main character JR who is a teenager who is faking being a corporate giant, is talking in a phone booth, and then by kismet, characters walk by, and you end up leaving the phone conversation and walking on with
going on with it. And does he
going on
use
with the
that
other
thing
folks.
of switching from one consciousness to another throughout the novel?
Yeah, throughout the novel.
Well,
And
do you
so
know,
I just wondered if you were a William Gaddis fan.
I confess I've never read Gaddis, and I would admit, and I'm shocked and appalled to have this tiny scintilla of originality robbed from me. Because not only had I not read Gaddis, but it would appear that none of the critics who have written on these novels have read Gaddis or that novel either, because none of them commented. You, like him, could just stay right here. You're not coming any further on this tour.
And then I wondered, who are the writers that you admire, and do they end up appearing in some way, since there's so much sort of illusion or loose association?
Yeah, I mean, I think years ago I wrote, "Thank you for your question," and not so thank you for the other I don't know. I kind of, it's quite interesting. A few years ago, well, quite a number of years ago, I wrote a version of Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray, and one of the interesting exercises fictionally was to place it in a believably Wildean milieu in which nobody had ever heard of Oscar Wilde or the picture of Dorian Gray, because that would kind of destroy the fictional conceit. And who could I substitute for Wilde, as it were, and to be a source of witticisms and aperçus and that kind of thing. So what can I say? I mean, I don't think a lot about... I mean, there will be many allusions to things literary in the text, and it seems to me that one of the kind of things we're debating very much at the moment in the literary world is the decline of the canonical, the decline of the sense that books influence one another or are related to one another, and that some books are better than others. And that some books are better than others in particular because of the way they relate to other texts. And I think we're going through a step change, and that there are new voices coming forward into literature, and I welcome that, from different communities. I think the novel is essentially a middle-class form. It's a form born of Enlightenment values in that way. That's inescapable. But I don't really see any necessity to be ashamed of that. You know, I think it's a kind of good thing. What's wrong with that? I'm not really answering your question. Basically, I would imagine the fingerprints of the writers I love are all over the text, but I so much so that it's probably smeary with allusion. And yet I hope not, because what I very much try to do, and this is a kind of argument about modernism really, and I was with Martin Amis in New York a couple of nights ago speaking at the 92nd Street Y, and Martin was saying that that I'd abandoned what he called social realism. I'd abandoned and I said, well, I don't call it social realism, and actually I think modernism is the appropriately naturalistic technique for conveying the nature of reality and existence in the current era, and particularly because the wealth of allusions that I try and put into these texts relate to the quotidian stuff that's in people's minds: advertising jingles, pop songs, indigestion. The stuff that, what strikes me so much about what people think of as conventional social realist fiction is how unreal it is. Nobody has a bowel movement in lots of novels. Most of the literature in this bookstore is hopelessly constipated. It was said of Joyce that he kind of took the reader into the bedroom and the bathroom, and frankly, most readers have been frantically trying to get out ever since. But the fact of the matter is, if you want to write realism, and if you think about the psychic content, what's in your head right now, back to phenomenology, if we could bracket
your mind and actually analyze it all, would it look like what's in Anna Karenina's mind, or even what's in Stephen Dedalus or Leopold Bloom's mind? So much of it's redundant. So much of it would be incomprehensible to anybody else but you, because it's in your own idiolect. So, I think the idea of social realism being a naturalistic form is absolutely absurd. And what I've tried to do in these books is, and Joyce did do this in Ulysses, was to have allusions in here that you can't possibly get in that way. But I think the paradox of the contemporary era in literature is we now often will find ourselves reading on a device where we can just push the illusion we don't get and we'll find out what it means. So, the text has jumped its own boundaries in that sense, and the novel form, which was based on the codex, is now, I would argue, in a pretty tricky position, because readers don't need to be confined to the codex. In the old days, when you were reading a book like this and you came across a word you didn't understand, you'd read on, because you'd think, I might come across that word in another context, and then that will explain it, and I can retrospectively understand what it means there. If you came to an illusion you didn't understand, you'd read on, expecting that the text might inform you. But there's no necessity for that anymore. So, in a sense, what I'm saying is that those old social realist books, nobody needs to write like that anymore. There's no necessity to write in that way, and yet, of course, people still are. So,
may I ask a question about contemporary British politics?
Please do.
Yes.
It's not
So I saw in the news today, someplace, that the British might be having second thoughts about Brexit to the extent there might actually be a vote. What are your thoughts about that? And my second question is, could you talk about your typewriter collection a little bit?
I'll do the typewriters first. In 2004, I wrote my first few books on an old Amstrad PCW 9512 word processor that my late mother, who died in 1988, left me. And I wrote my first few books on that. And then in 2004, and it wasn't until a year or two later I realized why, I switched to working on a manual typewriter for first drafts. Okay, I would then rekey it into a computer file for the publisher, but though actually one book I sent all the way to the typesetters in hard copy in TypeScript. Why 2004? The inception of wireless broadband. Up until 2004, if you were working on an old word processor, you were still contained within it. After 2004, you're trying to write, and you think, oh, I wonder what it looks like if a man's got his head up a donkey's butt. And Hosanna, you can see that in a split second. Or you might think, oh, I really need some reindeer hide oven gloves. Yeah? Or even worse for a writer of fiction, you're writing and you're thinking, she drove a Corvette Stingray, and you think, I kind of remember what a Corvette Stingray looks like, but I'll just quickly have a look at an image of one, okay? Then you describe the image. Okay, you're no longer thinking in words, you're no longer thinking as a writer should, from within the body of language, as if that's your phenomenology. You're using language to describe images, which is a totally different thing. And I think intuitively I realized not only all of those problems, the distraction and the sort of graphicism that would infect your prose if you continually were describing images on screen, but I think I also realized that writing books on a wireless-enabled computer was, in a sense, in the praxis, in the act of writing it, you were already bursting out of the confines of the text, just as I've been explaining we already are with our reading habits. So it seemed inimical to... So I moved back onto working on manuals, and the manual typewriter I had then was, again, Mummy's. Mummy was born in Columbus, Ohio in 1922, and my mother was American, and when she came over to England in 58, she brought her Olivetti Letterer 22 with her that she'd learnt to type on, and that she'd been a secretary on and a typist, and I've written a lot of books on that machine. It's still going well. I haven't seen Shalom Simons, the only extant typewriter repairman in London, for a while now. He keeps threatening to retire. He's in his 70s. I then got interested in, as you do, bought more typewriters. The one I loved most was, I don't know if you saw a movie called The Lives of Others about East German dissidents a few years ago. Well, they have a typewriter in that called a Groma Calibri, which was the thinnest typewriter ever made. It's only like 2 inches high. And the reason they're obsessed with this typewriter is they can hide it under the lintel of the door from the Stasi. And I loved the look of that typewriter, so I wrote a book on that one. I think I wrote Shark on the Groma Calibri. And in the way of these things, at one point I think I had 7 or 8 typewriters. And then I thought, ça suffit, enough. And I've given them away to students and young people who've shown any interest in them, because I figure, no, in all seriousness, just as you might give a younger person a fountain pen back in the day, I thought, well, maybe this typewriter will lead them back into the novel in a more engaged way as a literary form. British politics, second referendum, Brexit, why not? Why not a second referendum? That's what democracies are about, right? You see with the... Let me just tell you one anecdote which will answer your question for you. A friend of mine was recently at a lunch in the Cotswolds, the hills to the north of London, at which the former Prime Minister, David Cameron, was in attendance. And Cameron, it was indeed, who called the referendum. He called it in order to deal with the Brexiteer wing of his own party. So he did it like a lot of this constitutional tinkering. It's really being done for party political reasons, not because of some vision of the country's future. And of course, he screwed up badly and lost power over it. So he's at this lunch, and as Shakespeare would have said, he's in his cups. And he starts expostulating to the room in general about how bloody awful things are and how pissed off he is that his rep has fallen. And one of the other people at the lunch gets up, goes over to Cameron's chair. He's sitting in an armchair. It's after lunch. And he puts his arms on the arms of the chair and brings his face right up to Cameron's. Are there any children in the room? Excuse my language. This is how the English upper classes talk to each other. He looks Cameron right in the face and he says, "Not even my fucking golf club changes its rules on a majority vote." I mean, a majority vote for something like leaving the European Union? We've been in the European Union for nearly 50 years. I mean, that is a constitutional settlement of some solidity. My children, I have 4 children, and they all phoned me on the morning that the vote came in, all of them in tears. They're all grown up, except for the younger. In tears. In tears. My eldest son said, "I'm a European. What have they done to me?" So, I think you probably know where I stand on this one. Yes.
Hello. So I'm a total newcomer to your work. Building on your discussion of kind of the social realist novel and your typewriter collection, do you think have you thought about or have you experimented with writing literature in web-only forms or kind of unbound from the novel? Do you think that's inimical to literature?
No, I don't. And clearly something's going to happen. I mean, I definitely think that the novel has moved to the side of the cultural conversation. It's going to be like easel painting or the symphony. No, it is. Trust me on that. I mean, again, I was in New York a couple of nights ago, and we were thinking about what's happened with writers and here's a good one, Norman Mailer. Okay, maybe not the most the figure you'd most want to hear from in the year of Me Too, and I quite understand that. But nonetheless, it's 10 years since Mailer's death. You never hear his name anymore. His books are out of print. This was the man who, when he was alive, was considered the greatest living writer in America, won the Pulitzer Prize twice. I asked my students, I don't teach creative writing because I think that sucks, but I do teach literature. Well, I think writers are autodidacts necessarily. To be a writer is to teach yourself. The act of writing is teaching yourself. So we don't do that. All you need to do to become a writer is live and read. That's the thing. And the problem I see teaching literature now is that the kids come through and they haven't done 10,000 hours of reading. They just haven't read enough books. And I asked my class, third-year undergraduates in English literature, if any of them had read Norman Mailer. No. I asked any of them if they'd ever heard of Norman Mailer. No. Okay? And this is not untypical. So, when you shake your heads because I say the novels, listen, if the novel is like the easel painting or the symphony, we'll have done well, frankly, yeah? Because the thing about visual arts is any Dumbo can stand in front of a painting and go, oh, why do we think Warhol was so popular? It's like, but a novel requires some commitment. When they put somebody reading a proper novel in a PET scanner or a CAT scan, every area of the brain is lit up. This is not a form that you can stroll into lightly. Writing for the web, writing in different forms, fine, but it ain't going to be the novel for the reasons I've adverted to in answering earlier questions. The novel demands the codex. That's what the form is sustained by. It's a form for the codex. To think of the novel without the codex is like thinking of paint floating in midair without canvas behind it. It's just not going to work in that way. Ever since computers came along, people were working on hypertext fictions in the 1980s. People were trying to get this form to work in a new substrate, and everybody's failed for the reasons I've adverted. There will be a new central narrative medium in our culture. It ain't going to be film. It's probably going to come out of computer gaming. We haven't got there yet, but your generation will bring it to fruition. And I think there is the potential for computer-based forms to be as complex and as interesting and as engaging as the novel, but I don't know what they're going to be, and I'm going to be dead when it happens, either by my own hand or natural causes. So,
I first came across your work about 3 years ago, and it was a digital essay you did on Kafka. And there was a lot of the allusions and references there. Was that the beginning of this sort of modernist approach for you, or did it begin in nonfiction and you transfer it to fiction, or?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you should raise that apropos this young woman's question before. I mean, I was approached by the Arts Council in England to do this thing called a digital literary essay. But what was it, really? You've seen it. It's just basically a text, and you can hit on some things, and you get movies and interviews and add-ons. I mean, at the core of it is still a text. It's maybe a little unconventional for a literary essay, but it's not that unconventional. No, the kind of modernist turn for me came with a book I wrote called Walking to Hollywood in about 2007, about 11 years ago. And I the modernist turn is rather like the linguistic turn in philosophy. I think once you've taken it, it's very hard to turn back, because what it really consists in is jettisoning the third-person impersonal narrator. They were all at Politics and Prose. It was a Saturday evening. It was raining heavily outside. Who's telling you this? Who is that? And once you lose faith in the impersonal third-person narrator, which frankly is God, under another name, it's where, and there's no coincidence in my view that the novel as a form solidifies around the time that Darwin publishes The Origin of the Species, because it seems to me the exaltation of the kind of world of the novel with the godlike third-person impersonal narrator is a kind of substitution for a post-Lapsarian world in which God is dead, you know. So, but once you've lost faith in that God narrator, you also lose faith in what I call the simple past. You know, everything is in the present in my world. It's in the continuous present. Every moment I've lived through has been now. You know, it's never been Will was at Politics and Prose. I'm here right now. And I think the problem is that once you take that leap into writing into the continuous present, getting rid of the godlike narrator, very hard to go back. So, yeah, it happened around 11 years ago. And, you know, just don't read too many modernist writers. They really get to you.
Does Buddhism inspire your work at all?
Well, the great Russian writer Turgenev was asked what he thought of Buddhism, and he said, what's the difference between a white void and a black void? Well, a white void's brighter. Yeah, enormously. And Busner's the protagonist of this novel is very, you know, he's modeling himself as a sannyasin. He thinks he's kind of left his worldly goods. He's reached the life stage of renunciation. He's got a copy of the Diamond Sutra. He's very preoccupied by Buddhist ideas. And I have been intermittently for many, many years. Yeah, I don't practice myself. I'm a bit of the white void, black void school, but I certainly think it's a very, very valuable insight. Yeah. Anybody else?
Well, I told you so.
Thank you.
So now your task